Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So I got a lot of really good comments in my last video, and I want to touch on a couple of them here and look at, well, primarily, who is the patient zero for your quote-unquote progressive comics, what people call SJW comics. Who is the patient zero? Where did this come from? Historically, because, well, it wasn't that very long ago historically, but I want to look at that for several reasons. Number one being because, well, the whole reason why you study history to begin with is that you don't want to repeat the same mistakes in the future. And number two, because, well, I primarily studied political theory, and that's different from studying something like philosophy, even though you go over the same ground, because when you study political theory, you also look in-depthly at how these ideas impact people on the ground. And that's really important in my estimation. I have a lot of people in my comments saying, well, you're talking about this thinker and that thinker, or this kind of ideology, and that's not what it says at all. Look, it says the exact opposite right here. Well, first of all, to those people I say, when you look at people who write political ideology, they're very good at deceiving you. But if you have a theory, if you have an idea, if you have a political system, and every time people try to implement it, it turns out that X, Y, and Z happens, well then one of two things is happening. Number one, either your political philosopher who came up with it actually intended X, Y, and Z, or if he intended the opposite, then there is something fundamentally wrong with his theory. And the third reason why I want to do it is because, well, I want to use this as a jumping off point for other videos, because I have a lot to say about this, too much to say in one video. But I want to start here, even though I might be going over a little bit of ground that I covered before. And although I used to do research for a living, so I'm fairly good at it, I certainly don't get things right all the time, and it seemed like from the information that was presenting itself to me that I actually only needed to do a small amount of research to get to this point. But if I get anything wrong, or if anybody wants to point out other facets of this in the comments, please do so. Now, if you listen to my last video, it will be no surprise to you that I would say the patient zero for your progressive comics is Joe Quesada. But again, let's look at the history of this. Let's look at what is going on and how and why he actually began this progressive movement within comics. Because I would say that this progressive movement started long before him. There were strains of progressivism in comics as far back as I can go, but I would say it really took root within the mid to late 90s, between 90 and 97. So that precedes him by a fair bit. But what I'm going to talk about is Joe Quesada in the year 2009. Because prior to that, progressivism was certainly heavily overlaid onto comics. But I think the origin point of the problems that we have right now began in 2009. So if you look at the comic industry prior to 2009, say 2007, 2008, 2009, within the reign of Joe Quesada at Marvel, you will see an industry that is having a little bit of a problem. Now, I'll put the numbers up in the background for you so that you can confirm this yourself. If you look at the numbers from 1997 to 2009, and if you look at the number of comics sold by your comic producers, it goes down. It steadily goes down. Now, if you look at their bottom line, it went down and then back up and then back down again. So if you look at the numbers for comics shipped, its high point is 1997. And after that point, it begins to go down steadily until you hit 2002. And then it slowly starts to bring itself back up again. And it brings itself back up until we hit 2007. And then you see another decline. And you can see the decline going into 2008, 2009, and then continuing on to 2010. And if you look at the numbers of the money actually made by the comic industry, you will see another decline after 1998. But then we have an increase within the money made. But of course, if you follow the chart over and you compare the number of copies sold with the actual price rise within your standard comic, you will see that that money being made successively by year is because comics were going up in price, not because more comics were being sold. And if we look at Marvel specifically, we can see that Marvel is in full swing with its events. It is trying to push up numbers through events. You have things like Secret Invasion, you have things like Civil War, you also had the Ultimates going on at this time, which I would just consider a big event that went on for years. But this is what Marvel was trying to do. It was trying to push up numbers through these events, and it managed to do so a little bit here and there. But when you hit 2006, 2007, 2008, you will see the sharp decline within the number of comics sold. So you have Joe Quesada, who is reigning at Marvel as the head of Marvel Comics, and he is trying everything that he can with these event comics to push up the numbers for Marvel. But it is simply not working when we get to the point of 2006, 2007, and 2008. No matter what they do, the numbers seem to be going down, and the only way that they can keep a steady revenue going is by putting the comic price up. Now, having looked at that, what is the mindset of Joe Quesada at this time? I want to thank Coleman, I think it was, in the comments for my last video for pointing this out. I've actually confirmed what he has said, that Joe Quesada at this time was saying that comics were getting stale, that Marvel in particular was simply telling the same story over and over again, and this is why comics were in decline, and this is why sales for Marvel were in decline. He felt that Marvel was simply doing the same thing over and over again, and it wasn't working for them. And so he was trying to do something new in order to generate more sales for comics. Now, while all of that is very interesting, it may not have prompted Joe Quesada to make any drastic change within Marvel Comics if something else was not happening at the time. In August 2009, Disney announced that it was going to buy Marvel Comics for $4 billion. That's billion with a B. So a lot of money is changing hands here. And this is August of 2009. Now, the sale did not take place until December of 2009. And if you look at statements of Joe Quesada and other quote-unquote professionals within Marvel that run the company, you can see that they are left in the dark. They do not really know what is going on. As late as October, November of that year, which is only 1 month before the actual sale took place, you have statements from one comic pro working at Marvel saying, it may be good, it may be bad. We simply do not know. And you have statements from Joe Quesada. And what he is doing is he is hanging off the words of Bob Iger and the announcements, the public announcements that he makes, to see if he can figure out, in his words, how this is going to change the comics that they make. So Joe Quesada really has no information. He is depending upon the public statements of Disney to see how this will affect the way comics are being made. So, in my estimation, if you look at the public statements of these people who work for Marvel, and especially Joe Quesada at this time, between August and December of 2009, when they were about to be taken over by Marvel, these pros, like Joe Quesada, who run Marvel, were, in my estimation, visibly shaken, because they simply did not know what was going to happen to Marvel Comics after Disney purchased Marvel. Now, add to that the fact that if you look at Disney, it is a giant corporation that deals with entertainment, but it deals with mass entertainment for the mass audience, that is to say, everyone. But if you look at Marvel Comics is an entertainment company that deals with a very small subsection of the population, which at that time they would commonly refer to as fanboys. And so if they're going to be gobbled up by this giant corporation who is simply looking to obtain the intellectual property of Marvel and use it for mass sale of all of these characters, then what is going to happen to Marvel Comics? Well, again, this is up in the air, and they really didn't know. So, I would say that this uncertainty, combined with the failing sales of Marvel at the same time, prompted Joe Quesada to act. And what he did was he wanted to fundamentally change not just the stories that were being told at Marvel, but the way comics themselves were made. And this is the infection point. This is where we have patient zero, Joe Quesada, taking this disease of progressivism and mutating it to a point where he passes it on to the first carrier, who will then pass it on to successive people after that. And this passing on from patient zero of Joe Quesada is from him to Sana Amanat. When he first hires her, and she was hired, it appears, in October of 2009. So a couple of months after Joe Quesada learned that Disney was going to take over Marvel, and he was in this visibly shaken state, and he is looking at the numbers, I would say, and seeing that they are simply telling the same story over and over again, and it's not working for them, he decides to act before the sale actually takes place. And we can see from what happens afterwards that his intent was to take Marvel Comics and to put it into a sphere where it was going to be something that was for everyone. That is to say, he didn't want to sell to fanboys anymore. He could use that base, but he wanted to change comics in order to make them into something for everyone. Now, we know this from statements of Sana Amanat, because what had happened at that point, and if you listen to my last video, you already know this, is that you have Sana Amanat. She worked for a small indie company, and after that indie company folded up and went to India, I guess it was, she decided to get out of comics. She was going to look for something else to do, and so she was not looking to come back into comics. She was not looking for a job at Marvel in any way. Joe Quesada purposefully sought her out and offered her a job at Marvel, saying, "We have a job waiting for you." And the words of Sana Amanat is that she told him, "Look, I don't have the experience. I don't think I can do this. What you want me to do is to change Marvel," because that's what he told her and that's what she said. He wanted her to change Marvel. And she said, "I don't have the experience. I can't do this." And his words to her were, "That's what we want. We want someone who does not have experience." Why? Because we want to fundamentally change not just the stories that are being told, but the way comics are made entirely. And what was the reason, again, for this change entirely of making comics? Well, it was because he wanted to change the audience for these comics. He wanted to make something that was not just for fanboys. And again, these are statements straight from Sana Amanat. And so his intent was to take Marvel Comics and make them, as they always talk about, for everyone, or at the very least to say that there is a comic for everyone, and so expand their audience beyond the normal fanboys so that they could make it for a mass audience, just like Disney does for its own entertainment and was going to use the intellectual property from Marvel to do. And so I think this is in part Joe Quesada simply trying to save his own skin, or to save his legacy, or to save Marvel Comics to some extent, because he simply did not know what was going to happen, and he knew that they were going into a decline. Now, I want to break off from this history for a minute and talk about the ideas behind how he hoped to change Marvel. Because how he hoped to change Marvel was to put this progressivism right in the middle of everything that they were going to do to produce comics. But when you look at progressivism as a movement itself, quote unquote progressivism, it gets itself into a catch-22 right off the bat. Because it denies any idea of truth whatsoever. And if you deny ideas of truth, you deny any fixed points. And if you don't have any fixed points, there's no fixed point for you to move away from, nor is there a fixed point for you to move towards. And if there's no fixed points that you can either move away from or towards, then there can be no actual progress. You can have no progress unless you have something to move either away from or towards, which again they erase with the idea of erasure of truth. Now, some people might say that they are looking to progress in a way that they free people from every constraint that they can, and so bring about what they call the sovereign individual. That is to say, every individual is only beholden to himself. He has no duty, he has no compunction to anything but himself whenever he makes a decision. So he has no need to think about the good of his conscience, the good of others, the good of a child, the good of a wife, the good of a family, the good of a community, the good of a nation, the good of a god, the good of truth or reality itself. All of those things are placed secondary to the sovereign individual. He only makes decisions based upon what is best for him, and that's it. And that's their claim of how they are progressing, because they are bringing about more and more freedom towards the sovereign individual. But that again brings them into a catch-22, which is the fact that this is not a political movement because it takes all these sovereign individuals and allows them to move in every direction that they possibly can go. And so when you have individuals going hell, west, and crooked, and you have a political movement which is supposed to be based upon the polis, based upon the many, you're supposed to have the many move in one direction, and all of these individuals within this so-called movement are moving in any way that they want. This is not a political movement, first of all, and secondly, it doesn't bring about any progress because, again, you have people working at cross purposes. And the only thing that they can do in order to claim that it is actual progress is to subject the individuals to to the group, and if they do that, they destroy the idea of the sovereign individual. So again, they put themselves in a catch-22. There is no progress. They cannot actually progress because they have destroyed any notion of truth, and so there's nothing to move towards, there's nothing to move away from. So in order to get out of this little catch-22, what they believe that they do to get out of it, is that they substitute the idea of change for progress. And so, whenever you have change, it is automatically progress. Now, this change has to be something that has never been done before, because if your intent is to go back and do something that has been done before, even if it worked, that's still regress. So you can't do that. So you need to promote change, and change in their mind is automatically equal with progress, as long as that change doesn't have any ties to anything that has been done before. Now, of course, this is a logical fallacy. This is just equivocation, straight out. It is not rational in any way. And by the way, if you see the word change just splashed over things, then it doesn't have any actual content or meaning, especially when it's connected to politics, that's a giant red flag. But anyways, so Joe Quesada wanted to change Marvel Comics. This is the exact word that Alterna used. He wanted to change it with the hiring of her. And this change was automatically going to be good and automatically going to be progressive. Because what he was looking to do, well, basically, she was a diversity hire. She had no experience, and that's what they wanted. And the reason why they stated they were going to hire her was because she had a quote-unquote unique voice. Because she had all of these different identity markers that made her very progressive. And we can see this very simply in the statements from Marvel after she began to change Marvel. They're always talking about diversity. This is their tag word that they use to say that they're expanding their audience. But of course, we all know that, especially today, if you look at the word diversity, what it is code for. It is code for your progressive ideology. This is what they want. They want quote-unquote diversity by bringing in new people that have quote-unquote unique voices that don't have experience but can change comics in the fundamental way that they are made. Now, briefly, did Joe Quesada actually change the way comics were made? I would say no, not at all. Because, as I had indicated at the first, I would say that at least from the mid-90s up until 2009, there was a heavy layer of progressivism on top of comics to begin with. There were hints of it before that, but this was a heavy layer within that 10 to 12 years at least. But the thing is that in making the comics, they were simply taking as their baseline a good story and good art, and that it was simply a good comic based upon what had worked in the past. And this progressivism was layered over top of it. Heavily layered, but layered over top of it. And what Joe Quesada sought to do in order to change fundamentally the way comics were made is to get rid of the baseline of what they had done in the past. This is very specifically what his intent was with hiring people like Alterna who had no experience. This was a break from the past, a break from all of that experience and the traditional way of making comics. And so he erased that baseline of experience and the traditional way of making comics, and he simply replaced that baseline with progressivism itself. So that progressivism becomes the baseline of how and why you make comics. Now, in my personal estimation, I would say if they're looking for something to blame the decline of comics on since 1997, it would be progressivism. That was certainly why I left. It was 1997. I had struggled for about 3 years saying to myself, why in the world am I spending this much money on entertainment where people are simply preaching to me ideas that I do not agree with? And that's why I left. So from personal experience, as a person who loved comics, the reason I was driven away was because of progressivism, and that was as far back as 1997. And if they are looking for something to blame the decline between 1997 and 2009 on, I would say it was progressivism. But no, Joe Quesada wanted to make this progressivism the bottom line, the baseline of how comics were made. And so his fundamental change, in my estimation anyways, was certainly not going to bring about a rejuvenation of comics themselves. But I'm going to do entire separate videos on that hopefully in the near future. What I want to concentrate on here, again, is the history. We want to bring it forward just a little more, because we see that we have this transmission of this virus of progressivism from patient zero, which is Joe Quesada, and it is mutated and brought into the bloodstream of comics by Sana Amanat. And the thing is that if you look at the way Sana Amanat was hired, as someone with a quote-unquote unique voice, someone who didn't have experience, someone brought in to change the way comics were made, someone brought in so that they could have a diverse audience, this is the exact way that Sana Amanat herself began to influence not just the comics, but the way that people were hired by Marvel Comics after this. I have covered a number of times in which she has done so. I have a number of videos going over that. This is the exact way that she promotes the hiring of people at Marvel, was the exact same way that she was hired at Marvel. They go and find you. They don't look for people that actually want to work for Marvel. They go and find somebody who they think has a unique voice, who really doesn't have any experience within comics, because they believe that unique voice will diversify their readership, because they want a diverse readership base. So this is where this infection not only came from, but how it exploded into the bloodstream of comics, certainly beginning with Marvel and then moving onwards to the other companies as well. And I want to end by saying the following. The reason why I said at the first we should look at history is so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We can predict what is going to happen in the future by looking at what has happened previous to now. And the thing is that if you look at those numbers, I'll bring them back up on the screen. If you look at those numbers from the comic industry and look at 2016, 2017, 2018, what do you see? You see another decline within the comic industry, because Joe Quesada did manage to bring up the numbers slightly and bringing up the money intake of the comic industry and Marvel itself, I would say, because of their pushing up of the sale price of the comics, nothing else. But he did manage to bring it up to a point. But if you look at 2015 in particular, this is when they stopped for a little bit putting up the price of comics. And when they stopped putting up the price of comics, the numbers for the comic industry of how much money they made went down. And it went down for 2 successive years. And then from 2016 to 2017, it pretty much stayed the same. And their numbers for money made went down. But the thing is, if you look at 2018, there's a sharp increase within what comics were being sold for. And yet, the numbers are still going down. So the point is that what is going on right now in the last 3 successive years, it looks very similar to what was going on within 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010 within the comic industry, which is the exact time that Joe Quesada decided to take a sledgehammer to the comic industry and take out the very foundation of how to make comics. And if we take history as any indication that what has happened in the past is going to happen in the future, since that decline is now beginning again, and we are almost at the end of that point, then the question becomes, what are you going to see within the near future happen to the comic industry? Now, as I said, they are looking for change. The baseline of comics right now is progressivism. That's it. And so they need to progress all the time. There can be no going back. They cannot regress. If they do so, they will be tearing the entire industry apart. Or to put it in a different fashion, the people who work for all of the industry, all of these progressive people that run all the way through the industry, they would tear it to pieces from the inside out if they started to regress backwards towards the old way of making comics. But they're going to have to do something. The numbers indicate that they are going to have to do something. And that massive change is simply going to be a dive further down the rabbit hole of progressivism. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And certainly, if you have anything to add to this conversation, please leave it in the comments, or if you want to correct me on any points, do that as well. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.